She was sent as a joke. She stayed as a reckoning, a town full of whispers, a man who trusted no one, and a woman nobody saw coming, until she saved everything they tried to take from him. They dressed her up and shipped her off like unwanted furniture. They laughed as the wagon pulled away. They placed bets on how fast Rhett Calder would send her back. Not one of them saw what she carried inside. Hit-like. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one doesn't let go. Black Ridge, Texas Territory. Autumn, 1881. The morning Mara Holloway left Black Ridge, nobody came to say goodbye. That wasn't entirely true. A few people came out. Dolores Pitcher from the dry goods store stood on the boardwalk with her arms crossed, watching. The Fenwick brothers leaned against the post outside the saloon, already half drunk at 8 in the morning, grinning like they'd paid for front row seats to something worth seeing. Old Clement Yates, who'd been the town's unofficial memory for 40 years, sat on his usual bench and watched from under the brim of his hat with an expression that might have been pity if he'd had any left. They weren't there to wish her well. They were there to watch. Mara knew it. She'd known it from the moment her Uncle Gerald had come to her 2 weeks prior, standing in the doorway of the barn where she'd been treating a lame mule's foreleg, and told her, not asked, told, that she was going to marry Rhett Calder. She'd gone very still when he said it, not from fear, from the particular stillness of a woman who has learned that visible emotion only gives cruel people more to work with. Rhett Calder, she'd repeated, not looking up from the mule's leg. That's right. Gerald had hooked his thumbs in his suspenders, proud of himself in the way small men are proud when they think they've solved a problem nobody asked them to solve. Man needs a wife. You need a situation. Simple as that. Mara had wrapped the mule's leg in a slow, methodical way, taking her time. Rhett Calder hasn't spoken to another soul in this town in 2 years, which is why he'll take what's offered. She'd finally looked up at him then. Gerald Holloway was 53 years old and hadn't done an honest day's work in a decade. He had her father's eyes, but none of her father's decency, and he'd been managing, which was his word for spending, what remained of the Holloway estate since her parents died 4 years ago. There was very little left to manage. You mean he'll take me, she said, because nobody else would. Gerald hadn't even flinched. I mean, he's a practical man in a practical situation, and you're a practical girl. She was 24 years old. She'd turned back to the mule. The wagon that carried her to Calder Ranch was borrowed from the Fenwick brothers, which meant it smelled like tobacco spit and old leather and something she preferred not to identify. Her belongings fit in 2 trunks: clothes, her mother's sewing kit, 3 books, and the worn veterinary manual she'd been reading since she was 12 years old. Not much to show for 24 years of living, but Mara had long since stopped measuring her worth by what she owned. She sat up front beside Deke Pullman, the hired hand Gerald had conscripted to drive her out. Deke was a decent enough man who had the good sense to feel uncomfortable about the whole arrangement and showed it by not speaking for the first 6 miles. Behind them, as the wagon rolled out of town, she heard the laughter. Not loud, not cruel in the theatrical way of people who wanted her to hear. Just the low, satisfied laughter of people who thought something funny was happening. She caught a piece of it. Dorothy Fenwick's voice, high and carrying. Poor Calder, doesn't even know what's coming. Mara kept her eyes on the road ahead. The Texas hill country in October had its own kind of beauty that people who'd been born into it tended to stop seeing. The sky was enormous and pale blue and streaked with clouds that looked like something had dragged fingers through them. The live oaks were still holding their leaves, dark and dusty green. The grass had gone gold and dry with the summer's heat, and it moved in the wind like something restless. She noticed all of it. She'd always noticed things that other people walked past. It was, she'd come to understand, one of the few things she had that nobody could take away from her. You ever met him? Deke asked finally, somewhere around mile 9. He'd apparently run out of silence. No. Heard things about him, I'd guess. Everybody's heard things about him, Mara said. Most of them are probably nonsense. Deke scratched the back of his neck. Well, some of it might be. What part isn't? He thought about that for a moment, watching the road. The part about him not being the kind of man who forgives things easy. That part's probably true. Mara considered this. Good, she said. Deke looked at her sideways. A man who doesn't forgive easily, she said, is a man who pays attention to what people do. That's not the worst quality. Deke didn't seem to know what to do with that, so he went back to not talking, and Mara went back to watching the country open up around them. So, Calder Ranch appeared after almost 2 hours of driving, and the first thing Mara noticed was the fence. Not the house. The fence. Or rather, what was wrong with it? The east boundary line ran parallel to the road for a quarter-mile before the ranch gate, and at least 4 sections of it were in bad repair. Posts leaning, wire hanging loose, one section knocked flat entirely. It wasn't storm damage. Storm damage had a particular look, a suddenness to it. This had been failing slowly over time, the way things failed when nobody was keeping up with them. She noted it without comment. The ranch house itself was a solid structure, 2 stories, limestone base, wood frame above. It had been built by someone who knew what they were doing and hadn't been maintained by someone who had the same intention. The porch railing on the south side had a gap in it. One of the shutters on the upper floor hung at an angle. The kitchen garden visible alongside the house had gone to scrub and dry weeds. But the barn was in good shape. That told her something. And the horses in the paddock, 3 of them, moving easily, well-muscled and bright-eyed, those told her something else. This was a man who knew what mattered to him. Rhett Calder came out of the barn before Deke had fully stopped the wagon. He was taller than she'd expected, which was saying something because she'd imagined him large. He had the kind of build that came from actual work rather than show. Broad through the shoulders, thicker in the forearms than the chest, moving with the slightly economical quality of someone who didn't waste effort. His hair was dark and needed cutting. His jaw carried a few days of growth that had stopped being intentional and was drifting towards something more permanent. He had a scar that started somewhere below his left ear and disappeared into his collar. He stopped at the edge of the porch and looked at the wagon, and his face did something she couldn't entirely read. Not surprise exactly, but something adjacent to it. Like he'd been told something was coming and still wasn't quite prepared for the reality of it arriving. His eyes found her. She held them, because she'd learned a long time ago that looking away first cost you something you didn't always get back. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Deke cleared his throat, climbed down from the wagon, and said, in the voice of a man who wanted to complete a transaction and leave, "Mr. Calder." Brought Miss Holloway out. As arranged. Rhett Calder's eyes moved from Mara to Deke and back again. "Set her trunks on the porch," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, rough at the edges. "Yes, sir." Deke was already moving toward the back of the wagon with more energy than he'd shown all morning. Mara climbed down without waiting for help. The wagon step was high, and there was a moment. She was aware of it happening, aware of how it looked, where getting down required some effort. She managed it cleanly and stood in the dusty yard and looked at Rhett Calder from 12 feet away. "Mr. Calder," she said. "Miss Holloway." A pause. "You're earlier than I expected. We left at first light." He nodded slowly. There was something in his eyes she couldn't yet name. Not the contempt she'd braced for, not the dismissal she'd anticipated. Something more careful than that. "I'll show you where you'll sleep," he said. "Then we should talk." He showed her to a room on the upper floor, plain, functional, with a window that faced east and a bed that needed new rope if the frame was going to be slept in without someone going through it eventually. She said nothing about the bed. She ran her hand along the frame and assessed it and filed it away. The room had a chest of drawers, a washstand, and a small mirror that had gone slightly cloudy at the edges. It was cleaner than she'd expected. He had, apparently, made some effort. "It's fine," she said, because it was. He lingered in the doorway with his arms crossed and his shoulder against the frame, and she became aware that he was watching her with that same unreadable quality, assessing, but not in the way the town had assessed her, not with contempt, with something more like caution. "You know what you're coming into," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know what I've been told," she said, "which I expect isn't everything." Something shifted in his expression. Slight. "No," he said, "it's not." "Then tell me the rest." He was quiet for a moment. She heard one of the horses in the paddock below. A short, sharp sound, not quite a whinny, and she saw his eyes flick to the window automatically. Whoever he was, the horses were a reflex. "Ranch is in trouble," he said finally. "Drought took a lot of the summer grass. Lost 8 head to the heat in July. I'm behind on payment to the bank. Not default, not yet, but close enough that men are paying attention." He said it flat, without apology or embarrassment. Just facts. "I needed someone to help. Take on the household work. The cooking. The mending." "Your ad said wife," Mara said. "It said wife. I mean it is a working partnership. If that's a problem—" "It's not a problem," she said. "I didn't come here expecting anything romantic, Mr. Calder. I'm not foolish, and I don't think you are either." He looked at her for another moment. "What did you expect?" he asked. Mara considered the question seriously because it deserved a serious answer. "I expected a hard man who needed something and was willing to accept help from someone other people had underestimated," she said. "So far, that appears to be accurate." Rhett Calder stared at her. Then he did something she hadn't anticipated. He almost smiled. Not quite. It didn't fully form, got halfway there, and retreated. But she saw it happen. "Supper's at 6, he said. "I'll be in the barn." Well, she was in the kitchen by 5. It was like everything else about the house, in a state of capable neglect. Things that worked but didn't shine. Things that were functional but not flourishing. The stove was a good one, heavy iron, and someone had kept it cleaned even if nothing else had received the same attention. She found flour, salt, dried beans, some hard cheese, a haunch of smoked meat hanging from a rafter. Enough to work with. She lit the stove, got the beans started, they'd need time, and went through the cupboards with methodical attention, taking inventory. When she found a jar of something that had gone bad enough to smell wrong through the sealed lid, she set it outside the back door without comment. When she found that the flour bin had a fine population of weevils, in the bottom third, she separated what was usable and marked the bin with a piece of string tied to the handle so she'd remember. She was rolling biscuit dough when she heard boots on the porch. Rhett came in through the back door and stopped just inside it, looking at her. She realized he hadn't expected to find her already working. There was a fractional surprise in his posture. "I found the smoked meat," she said. "Is there anything you can't eat?" "No." "Good." She turned back to the dough. "Beans will need another 40 minutes. Biscuits will be out in 20. He hung his hat on the peg by the door with the ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times in that exact spot, washed his hands at the basin, and sat down at the kitchen table. He didn't speak. Neither did she. It wasn't uncomfortable. That surprised her. When the biscuits came out, she put them on the table with the beans and the sliced smoked meat, and she sat down across from him and they ate. The food was plain. She was working with what she had. But she'd seasoned the beans well and the biscuits were light, and she watched him eat with the focused attention of someone who was actually hungry and eating food that met that need. Halfway through, he said, without looking up, "Better than I've had in a while." "The beans needed longer," she said. "Tomorrow, they'll be better." He looked up at that. She kept eating. After supper, she walked the property. Not all of it. There was too much of it for one evening, and the light was going. But she walked what she could, going east along the fence line she'd noted from the road, getting close enough to assess the damage. What she saw confirmed what she'd suspected. This wasn't wear. 3 of the 4 damaged sections showed the same pattern, wire cut and then rebent to look like it had broken, post shifted rather than knocked. Someone had been here, multiple times probably, doing small things. Things you might dismiss individually as bad luck or normal attrition. She stood at the furthest broken section and looked back toward the house, where a lamp had come on in the downstairs window. Then she crouched down and looked more carefully at the cut wire. The cut was clean. Someone with proper tools, not just a rough blade, not a drifter looking for scrap. Someone who knew what they were doing and wanted it to look like something else. She straightened up and brushed the dust from her skirt and walked back to the house in the last of the evening light. Rhett was on the porch when she came around the corner of the house. He had a coffee mug in one hand and was looking at the sky in the way of someone who had spent enough time reading weather to do it without thinking about it. He tracked her approach but didn't say anything until she'd come up the steps. "Walk the fence line," she said. "I saw." "East boundary, 4 sections down." She paused. Mr. Calder, when's the last time you walked it yourself? He looked at her. Couple weeks. Why? The damage on two of those sections isn't from weather or cattle pressure. The wire's been cut and made to look otherwise. Silence. Show me, he said. It's dark. Tomorrow morning, then. First light. He was looking at her with a different quality now. Not the careful caution from earlier. This was sharper, alert. You're sure? I'm not wrong about it, she said. I could be wrong about what it means, but I'm not wrong about what I saw. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then he nodded once and looked back at the sky. She went inside. Sleep came slowly that first night. Mara lay in the unfamiliar room with its unfamiliar sounds, the house settling, an owl somewhere to the north, a horse moving in the paddock, and she let herself very privately be something other than steady. She was 24 years old, and she had married a stranger to escape a household that saw her as a liability, and a town that had never once looked at her and seen what she actually was. She had done it with her eyes open and her chin level, and she did not regret it. But she was allowed, in the dark, to acknowledge that she was frightened. Not of Rhett Calder, specifically. He was not what she'd expected, and she was still in the process of understanding what he was. Frightened of failing. Of working as hard as she knew how to work and still having it not be enough. Of being sent back to Black Ridge, where people would nod and say they'd known it all along. She wasn't going to let that happen, but she was allowed, in the dark, to feel the weight of it. She fell asleep somewhere past midnight and dreamed of the fence line, the clean-cut wire, the precise, deliberate damage, and woke before dawn feeling the particular alertness of someone who has been told something important without quite understanding it yet. She was in the barn before Rhett. That was, she understood, a statement of intent more than necessity. She'd pulled on her work clothes, heavy skirt, boots, the old coat that had belonged to her mother, and carried a lantern out in the gray pre-dawn and let herself in through the barn's side door. The horses noticed her immediately. 3 of them in their main stalls, a dun mare who laid her ears back and watched with the careful suspicion of a horse that had learned to be cautious of new people. A dark bay gelding who pushed his nose to the stall door to investigate, and a big roan at the far end who just turned to look at her with large, calm eyes and then went back to his hay. Hey, she said quietly to the dun mare, not trying to make friends, just acknowledging. The mare's ears came halfway forward. Mara set the lantern on the hook near the door and moved along the stall row slowly, letting the horses read her. She wasn't rushing anything. She stopped at the bay gelding, who was still curious, and let him smell her hand. He blew a warm breath across her palm, and she noted the slight swelling at his right foreleg. Not serious, but worth watching. She was feeling along the gelding's foreleg when she heard the barn door open and Rhett's step on the dirt floor. He stopped. She looked up. His right fore has some heat in it, she said. Not bad yet. Does he work hard on that side? Rhett was looking at her in the early gray light with an expression she couldn't fully read. He had his hat on, a canvas coat, and the same look of careful assessment she was beginning to understand was just his face, how he processed information. He leans that direction on rough ground, he said slowly. You might want to watch how you're shoeing him. Farrier could be setting the shoe with a little too much toe out. That puts strain up through there over time. She straightened and moved on from the gelding. He's fine for now. Just watch it. Rhett came further into the barn and reached up to take down a bridle from a hook, and for a moment they were both just in the space together, doing things, breathing, not speaking. You know horses, he said finally. I know livestock, she said. My father kept a small operation, mostly cattle and hogs, but horses too. I've been reading veterinary medicine since I was 12. She paused. I'm not a trained veterinarian, but I'm not guessing either. He was quiet for another moment. Where'd your father's operation go? He asked. He died. My uncle managed what came after. She let the brevity of it be sufficient. He didn't press. Let's look at that fence line. What? They walked the east boundary in the pale early light, and she showed him what she'd found. The cut wire, the shifted posts, the careful restoration that was meant to disguise what had been done without eliminating the damage itself. Rhett crouched at the worst section and looked at it for a long time. His jaw was tight. She could see the muscle in it working. Someone's been here at least twice, she said, probably more, doing small things. Nothing dramatic enough to notice if you're not looking for it. I should have been looking for it, he said. It wasn't self-pity, it was just accurate, stated without flinching. You were managing a drought and a failing herd count and doing the work of 2 men, she said. You missed it. Now you know. He stood up and looked at her. You saw it in one evening. I came in without knowing what was normal, she said. Fresh eyes. It's easier. He turned and looked out across the land. The dry golden grass, the live oaks along the ridge to the north, the sky going pale blue above them. She watched his profile. He was angry. She could see it, controlled and held in, but there in the set of his shoulders and the line of his mouth. Who have you had trouble with, she asked. Plenty of people. Specifically, men who would want this land. He turned back to her. His eyes were dark brown, she'd determined in better light. Not black, as she'd first thought. The Donner Syndicate, he said after a pause that suggested he wasn't used to saying things out loud to people. Consolidated land operation out of San Antonio. They've been buying up ranches in this county for 2 years, or taking them when buying doesn't work. How do they take them? Bank pressure, sabotage. Make the operation fail enough that the man either sells cheap or defaults. He said it flatly, like someone who'd thought about it often enough that the telling of it had gone dry. Then they come in and pick it up for almost nothing. Mara looked at the cut fence wire. How long have they been interested in your land? Rhett's jaw tightened again. Since I refused their first offer, about 14 months ago. And you've been losing small things. Equipment, cattle, fence sections. She looked at him. Has it been steady, or does it come in clusters? He thought about it. Clusters, he said slowly. A bad week, then nothing for a while, then another bad week. They're not working constantly, she said. Someone comes out, does the damage, leaves, comes back when it's had time to add up. She paused. Do you know who they send? A person, I mean, not the organization. I have a suspicion, he said. Then that might be useful. He looked at her. She looked back. Around them, the morning light was strengthening and the dew was coming up off the dry grass, and one of the horses in the paddock called out once, sharp, and went quiet. You think like a man who's done something tactical, she said. Not quite an accusation. Something moved in his expression. Guarded, complex. I've had cause to, he said. That was all. She nodded and let it be. By the end of the first week, certain things had been established without being formally discussed. Mara woke first and had the stove going by the time Rhett came down. She managed the kitchen, the household accounts, which were, on inspection, in a state of creative chaos, and anything involving the livestock that needed attention beyond the main ranch work. She couldn't match him for the heavy labor, didn't try to, but she covered things he'd been letting slide for lack of time and energy, and she did it without announcement. She repaired 2 sections of the damaged fence herself, using wire and tools she'd found in the barn. Not perfectly. One section would need redoing properly, but it held. She organized the kitchen stores and found they had more to work with than the disarray suggested. She went through the household accounts and found 3 places where money was being lost to error or inattention. Rhett watched her do these things. She felt him watching, sometimes directly, sometimes from the corner of her awareness. She didn't perform for the watching, she just did the work. On the 4th day, he came into the kitchen at mid-morning when she was reviewing the accounts at the table and set a mug of coffee beside her without being asked. Then he sat down across from her. She looked up. You don't have to account for every minute, he said. In front of me. You don't have to prove something. She considered him. I'm not trying to prove something, she said. I'm trying to learn the situation, so I can actually help instead of just seeming helpful. He wrapped both hands around his own mug and looked at the account book between them. What do the accounts tell you? That you're tighter than you think, or maybe you know and you're managing it. She turned the book so he could see the column she'd been working through. There's a discrepancy here. Supplies charged in April that don't match what's in the storeroom, about $30 worth. Rhett leaned forward and looked at it. His expression didn't change, but she saw something move behind his eyes. Dale Farber, he said quietly. I hired him on for spring, let him go in June. He had access to the account? Ran supplies into town for me. Mara looked at the column. It's not a disaster by itself, but if there's more of it, show me where. They sat there for an hour, going through it together. She walked him through what she'd found, and he supplied the context, who'd had access, what period, what she might be misreading versus what she wasn't. By the end, they'd identified about $60 in losses that weren't where they should be, and two different people who'd had the opportunity. One of them was still working the ranch. Petey Groves? Rhett said. The name had a flat, contained quality when he said it.
I don't know him, Mara said. He's been with me 3 years. He stared at the accounts. I wouldn't have thought. He stopped. Do you want to confirm it before you decide what to do? He looked up at her. How? Tell him to pick up a supply order in town. Specific items, specific cost. See what comes back. He was quiet for a moment. You've done this before.
My uncle did something similar for 5 years before I understood what I was seeing, she said. I got good at identifying the pattern. His expression, for a moment, became something she couldn't name. Not pity, not sympathy exactly. Something more like recognition. Like seeing a piece of a map that explained terrain he'd been traveling through without understanding. He nodded once. Groves runs to town on Fridays, he said. I'll set it up. On Saturday morning, Petey Groves came back with 70 cents less than he should have had, and a receipt that had been smudged carefully, where the total should have been clear. Rhett dealt with it. Mara wasn't there for that conversation. She was in the barn, doing what she could for the gelding's foreleg, but she heard the tone of it from 50 feet away. Not loud. Worse than loud. The low, even, contained anger of a man who had decided something and was delivering it without room for negotiation. Petey Groves left the property within the hour. That evening, Rhett came to the kitchen doorway and stood there while she was finishing the supper dishes. You were right, he said, simply, not elaborately. I know, she said, and handed him a clean dish to put away because she wasn't going to make ceremony out of it. He almost smiled again. She was getting better at seeing it. That not quite smile, the thing that almost happened, and then decided against itself. She'd come to understand it wasn't coldness. It was the expression of a man who had learned that showing much of himself to other people was a risk he'd usually paid for. She understood that particular economy. There's more, she said, not turning from the basin. The fence damage, the accounts. Groves, maybe, or maybe not. That might be separate. It's not separate, Rhett said. His voice had changed, darker, more deliberate. She turned to look at him. The Donner Syndicate doesn't just cut fences and wait, he said. They put men in, slow work, from inside. He looked at the table, then back at her. I think Groves was reporting to someone. How long has he been? Since March. Maybe before. He put the dish on the shelf and stood with his back to her for a moment, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the kind that came from holding something that was getting heavier. I've been so focused on the drought and the bank that He stopped, started again differently. I missed it. You missed some of it, she said. You caught it now. You caught it. We caught it, she said, within a week of having someone around who had the time to look. He turned around and looked at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, there was something in his expression that was neither assessment nor caution. It was something she didn't have an immediate word for, something that made her look away first, not from weakness, but from a sudden, unexpected need to protect something she wasn't ready to examine. She turned back to the basin. The bank meeting is in 3 weeks, he said, after a silence. Quarterly review. How short are you? He told her. She thought about it. The cattle still going to market? Drive scheduled for November. What's the count looking like? If we keep from losing more, enough? A pause. Barely enough. She dried her hands on the towel by the basin and turned around and leaned against the counter. Outside the kitchen window, the sky was full dark now, and the stars were thick and white, and the night had gone cold in the way of Texas autumn nights that reminded you that winter knew where you lived. Then we don't lose more, she said. He looked at her. I know what they're going to do next, she said, or near enough. If they've been inside the operation and now that's gone, they'll escalate. They'll try something visible before the bank meeting, because the bank meeting is their window. She paused. We need to be watching from now until November. Everything. The herd, the fencing, the water supply, everything. That's a lot of ground to cover with 2 people and no hired hands I can trust right now. 3, she said.
He raised an eyebrow. Deke Pullman, she said. The man who drove me out here.
He's honest. Possibly unemployed. My uncle's operation doesn't have enough left to employ anyone properly. You could write him. Rhett looked at her for a long moment. You trust him? I trust that he's exactly what he seems, she said, which is more than I can say for most people I've met. He was quiet. Then, I'll write him tomorrow. She found the water line on a Tuesday. She'd been walking the south pasture, doing a count of the cattle grazing there. She'd taken that over from Rhett 3 days ago, freeing him for the heavier work that had been backing up. And she'd noticed that 3 of the cattle in the southeast corner were behaving oddly. Not sick odd, but restless odd, moving away from the water trough in the corner rather than toward it in the afternoon heat. She went to the trough. The water in it was clouded. Not just sediment, clouded with something that had a faint chemical quality she could smell when she got her face close to it. She didn't touch it. She pulled back and looked at the feed line running from the storage tank 30 yards away, and she followed it with her eyes, and she saw the place where it had been tampered with. A section of pipe that had been loosened and then rejoined, with a small crude bypass valve that had been packed with what looked like mineral residue. Someone had dosed the water line with something. Not enough to kill quickly. That would have been too obvious. Enough to make the cattle sick over time. Enough to weaken the herd before the drive. She stood in the afternoon heat and felt something cold and clear move through her. This was not amateur work. This was someone who knew cattle operations and knew exactly where to apply pressure and how much to apply without it being immediately obvious. She left the cattle away from the southeast section and walked back to the barn at a pace that was controlled but faster than her usual walk, and she found Rhett in the south paddock doing fence repairs, and she said, from a distance that was still too far for calm conversation, "There's something in the southeast water line." He dropped what he was doing. Well, they spent 2 hours on it. He confirmed what she'd found, traced the bypass valve, identified the residue as something he'd seen used to sicken cattle once before, copper sulfate in high concentration, not enough to see easily in water, enough to build up in the animals over 2 to 3 weeks and cause digestive failure. If you hadn't found it, he said, crouched over the pipe, the drive count would have been down by 10 or 15 head minimum, and they'd have died slowly enough that I'd have blamed the drought. That was the point, Mara said. He stood up and looked at her. His face was doing that controlled anger thing again. The tight jaw, the controlled burn in his eyes. When? Last few days, I'd guess. Maybe 4, 5 days ago. Groves, he said. Or whoever he was reporting to, or both. She looked at the bypass valve. He had access to the south pasture. He would have known the layout. Rhett was quiet for a moment, looking at the pipe. Then he looked up at her. You knew they'd escalate. I thought they would. You were out here checking because you thought they'd come at the water. It was the obvious next step, she said. Cut the fence to disrupt containment, tamper with the accounts to drain cash, and if neither of those forces assail or default, come at the herd health. It's a pattern. He stared at her. How do you know this pattern? She met his eyes. I told you. My uncle operated this way for years. Not at this scale, not with this organization behind him. He's too small for that. But the logic is the same. Find a man who's stretched thin and push him from 3 sides at once. She paused. The difference is, my uncle did it to me without knowing I was watching. Rhett was quiet for a long moment. And you watched, he said. I watched, she said, and I learned. He looked at her with that expression she didn't yet have a word for, the one that had appeared in the kitchen 3 days ago. It was more evident now, more present. Something in him that was shifting its assessment of her from useful to something else. She felt it, and she looked away from it, and she crouched back down to examine the valve more closely. We need to flush the entire line and replace the section, she said, and then we need to check every other water source on the property. That's a 2-day job. Then we'd better start tonight. A pause. Then his boots moved in the dirt beside her as he crouched down next to her to look at the pipe, and his shoulder was close enough to her shoulder that she could feel the warmth of him in the October air. All right, he said. They started that evening and worked until it was too dark to safely continue. Mara fell asleep that night with her hands aching and her boots still on and a full, exhausted, quietly fierce feeling in her chest that she recognized after a moment as satisfaction. She was doing something that mattered. She was not a joke anyone had delivered to a hard man. She was not a burden being managed or an embarrassment being concealed. She was here, and she was useful. And the things she'd been building in herself over the last 24 years, the watching, the patience, the knowledge accumulated from books and work and hard experience, all of it was being used. Let them laugh in Black Ridge. Let Dorothy Fenwick and the Fenwick brothers and old Clement Yates on his bench make whatever bets they wanted about how fast Rhett Calder would send her back. She was not going back. She was going to understand what was happening to this ranch, and she was going to help stop it, and she was going to do it quietly and without drama, and without needing anyone to acknowledge it. Outside, an owl called from the live oaks to the north. Inside, Mara Holloway, Mara Calder, she supposed, though they hadn't yet addressed that particular formality, lay on top of the covers in her boots and slept the deep, dreamless sleep of someone who has used the full extent of themselves. The night passed over the ranch like water over stone. The stars wheeled overhead, the cattle settled, and somewhere on the road between Black Ridge and the Donner Syndicate's offices in San Antonio, a man was riding with information and instructions, and the clock on all of it was turning. But that was tomorrow. Tonight there was just the owl and the stars and the woman who nobody had been watching closely enough. Deke Pullman arrived on a Thursday, 11 days after Rhett had sent the letter, driving a borrowed mule and carrying everything he owned in a single canvas bag. He was 41 years old, weathered down to the essentials, and he stood in the yard looking at the ranch with the careful eyes of a man who had worked enough different operations to read one at a glance. "Place needs work," he said. "Yes," Rhett said, "but it's solid underneath." "Yes," Deke nodded. Like that settled it and carried his bag to the bunkhouse without being shown where it was, which told Mara he'd worked enough ranches to know where bunkhouses generally ended up. She liked him for that. She liked even more that when he came back out and she was standing near the barn, he looked at her directly and said, "Miss Holloway, place treating you all right?" "Mrs. Calder," she said, because she'd decided that morning to use it. "And yes, well enough." He nodded again. "Good." Then he looked at Rhett. "What do you need first?" That was Deke. No performance, no questions about what had happened to the last hired hand, no sideways glances at Mara to figure out what she was doing there or what to make of her. He had a job. He intended to do it. Everything else was secondary. Within 2 days, she understood why she'd trusted him. He worked with the particular efficiency of someone who had been wasting effort his whole life and had finally stopped. He didn't cut corners, but he also didn't add flourishes. He fixed what needed fixing, asked questions when he didn't know something, and kept his opinions to himself unless someone asked for them, which, in Mara's experience, was rare and more valuable than most people understood. The fence sections she'd imperfectly repaired got properly done. The rotten post on the northwest corner of the main paddock, which she'd noted and flagged with a piece of red cloth, got replaced. He found 2 things she'd missed: a section of the barn roof that was one good rain away from becoming a section of the barn floor, and a problem with the main gate hinge that would have failed within the month. "You've got eyes," she told him, the evening of his second day, when they were both doing the kind of end-of-day tidying that happens in a working barn without anyone officially calling for it. "Spent a lot of years fixing things after they broke," he said, pushing a wheelbarrow toward the door. "Gets old. Easier to catch them before." She thought about that for a moment. "Deke, when you drove me out here, what were people in town saying, exactly?" He stopped the wheelbarrow, considered. He was a man who didn't answer faster than he thought, which she respected. "Some of it wasn't kind," he said. "I know that part. What was the specific shape of it?" He looked at her with a kind of reluctant honesty. "That Calder would take one look at you and put you back on the wagon. That your uncle was rid of a problem and Calder was about to become one." He paused. "Dorothy Fenwick had a whole theory about how it'd go." "What was the theory?" "That he'd let you work a week, realize you weren't what he needed, and send you back broke and shamed." Deke said it flat and factual. She was pretty confident about it. Mara picked up the pitchfork she'd set down. "What do you think now?" He looked around the barn, the organized tools, the clean stall floors, the gelding with his leg properly wrapped, the careful inventory list she'd pinned to the post near the door. Then he looked back at her. "I think Dorothy Fenwick doesn't know much about what people need," he said, and pushed the wheelbarrow outside. Mara went back to work and didn't say anything, but something in her chest loosened a fraction that had been tight since the morning she'd left town. The three of them fell into a rhythm over the following week that felt, to Mara, like the rhythm of a thing finding its natural level. Not smooth. There were frictions, miscommunications, days when the work was harder than the results justified. The drought hadn't broken. The grass in the south pasture was thinning to a degree that required moving the cattle on rotation more frequently than the land was really designed for. The water situation, once the contaminated line had been flushed and replaced, was stable but not comfortable. One of the cattle, a young steer, one of the stronger ones, started showing the early symptoms of what the contamination might have done if they'd caught it later, and Mara spent 2 evenings with him, monitoring, adjusting what she could. He recovered, but it was close enough to bother her. Rhett watched her work with the steer without comment. He wasn't a man who filled space with words when he didn't have something specific to say, and she'd come to appreciate that about him in a way she hadn't expected. She'd grown up around men who talked constantly as a way of asserting their presence, her uncle chief among them. The quiet of Calder Ranch, when it wasn't being filled with actual work-related conversation, felt earned rather than empty. It was on a Friday evening, 3 weeks after she'd arrived, and 2 weeks after Deke had joined them, that Rhett told her the rest of the story about his scar. She hadn't asked. She'd looked at it, couldn't help it, the way you can't help looking at something that's obviously the record of something significant. It ran from below his left ear down his neck and disappeared beneath his collar, and it had healed badly, which meant it had happened somewhere without access to good care, or at a time when care wasn't the priority. They were on the porch after supper, which had become a kind of unofficial habit. Not a formal thing, nobody had proposed it. But when the day's work was done and the dishes were clean and Deke had retired to the bunkhouse, they both sometimes ended up on the porch with coffee. Not always talking, sometimes just being in the same space as the darkness settled over the land. That particular evening, he'd been looking at the northern ridge for a while, the way he sometimes looked at things that weren't quite visible from where he was standing. "The Donner Syndicate," he said, without preamble. "I wasn't always on this end of them." She looked at him. "I worked for them," he said, 3 years ago, before I understood what the operation actually was. He turned the coffee mug in his hands. "I ran cattle assessments for them. Went to ranches they were interested in acquiring, evaluated the operation, told them what the land was worth." He paused. "Told them where the weak points were." Mara said nothing. Let him continue. "The man who ran field operations back then was named Cole Hartley. He was efficient, good at identifying exactly how much pressure to apply and where. I thought I was doing legitimate work. Land assessment, acquisition research." He stopped. His jaw tightened. "Then I was with Hartley when he delivered a final offer to a man named Ebner Walsh. Small operation, about 60 miles south of here. Walsh had been holding out for 8 months. He went quiet for a moment that had some weight in it. Walsh said no again, Rhett said. And Hartley responded to that. Not with words. He had 2 men with him. He reached up and touched the side of his neck, just below where the scar started, with 2 fingers. Just a brief touch. Reflex, maybe. I got in the way, which was not what Hartley expected." "Walsh?" Mara asked. "Walsh sold," Rhett said. "After. He didn't have much choice left." His voice had gone flat and careful. "I left the syndicate that day, came north, bought this land with what I'd saved and what I'd borrowed, and I have been here since." He looked at her. "So they know you," she said. "They know me, and they know I know enough about how they operate to make things complicated for them if I ever decided to." He set his coffee mug on the porch rail, "which is why they want this land specifically, not just for the land, to shut me up, make it look like a man who failed to hold his operation and had to sell." Mara absorbed this. The night insects were loud tonight, filling the dark with their particular urgent noise. A cloud had moved across the half moon and the yard was almost completely dark except for the lamp in the window behind them. "Who knows about your history with them?" she asked. "Nobody here. I came to Black Ridge as a man starting over. People had questions about the scar, about where I came from. I didn't answer them." He looked at her sideways. "They filled in the gaps themselves. It's how towns work." "They decided you were dangerous," she said. Based on nothing. Based on silence, he said, which in their experience usually means something worth being afraid of. Mara thought about that. Thought about how a reputation built from other people's assumptions could be both a prison and a protection, sometimes simultaneously. She'd had her own version of that. The town had decided what she was from the time she was about 15, and she'd spent nearly 10 years being invisible behind their certainty. Cole Hartley, she said. Is he still with the syndicate? Rhett was quiet for a moment. Far as I know. Is he the one who's been running the operation against you? The sabotage? I don't know, possibly. The work has his quality. Something moved across his face. Not fear exactly, but the specific alertness of someone who respects a particular danger. Mara turned her coffee mug in her own hands. It had gone cold and she hadn't noticed. If it's Hartley, she said slowly, then this isn't purely business. It's personal. He doesn't just want the land. He wants you specifically to fail. Rhett looked at her. Yes. Which means he'll stay engaged. Won't hand it off. Will want to be there when it resolves. A pause. Probably. She nodded slowly. Something was taking shape in the back of her mind. Not a plan yet, more the outline of a possible plan, the way a thing in the dark reveals its edges before its details. The cattle drive, she said. November. How public is the route? Rhett's eyes narrowed slightly. It's a standard route. Anyone in the county would know it. So Hartley would know it. If he's been watching the operation, yes. And he'd know the count, approximately, because of Groves. Rhett went still. Right, Mara said. Groves was reporting the count. Hartley knows how many cattle we're taking to market. He knows the route. He knows the timeline. She looked at Rhett directly. He's going to hit the drive. Silence. You don't know that, Rhett said, but his voice had the quality of a man who thought she was probably right. I know it's what I'd do, she said. If I were him. The bank meeting is after the drive. The drive is where the money comes from. Stop the drive, destroy the count, and you miss the bank payment. Bank loses patience. You have to sell. She set her cold coffee on the rail beside his. He's been wearing you down for over a year with small cuts. He's going to go for something larger. The drive is the target. Rhett stood up from his chair and moved to the porch rail and put both hands on it and looked out into the dark yard. She could see the tension in him, different from before. Not just the controlled anger, but something that had more fear in it. Not fear for himself, she thought. Something else. The fear of a man who has a thing worth losing and can see the thing that's coming for it. I can't protect a cattle drive through open country against men who are organized and willing to use violence, he said. Not with 3 people. No, she said. We can't protect it the way you're thinking. She stood up too, though she didn't move to the rail. She stayed where she was, thinking. But we might not need to protect it. We might be able to use it. He turned to look at her. Use it, he repeated. He expects a weakened operation running a diminished herd through a standard route with no help and no resources. She looked at him steadily. What if that's not quite what he finds? Rhett stared at her for a long moment. His expression was doing that complicated thing again, Shar, the one she'd been seeing more frequently, the one she didn't have a word for yet. She noticed, not for the first time, that when he looked at her directly like this, there was an intensity in it that she had to work to hold. Not threatening. Something she didn't quite know what to do with. You're talking about a trap, he said. I'm talking about giving him what he expects, she said, until we don't. He was quiet for a long time. If you're wrong about him hitting the drive, he started, then we run the drive, make the payment, and fight whatever comes next from the other side of the bank meeting. She kept her voice even. But I'm not wrong. He held her gaze. She held his back. I believe you, he said, and it was said simply, without drama, the way he said most things that mattered, just stated, like a fact he'd verified. Something moved through her when he said it. Not loud, not dramatic, just the quiet shift of a thing that hadn't been there before, taking up a small but definite amount of space in her chest. She looked away first. Not from weakness, from the same instinct that made her keep a few things close. We need to think about the route, she said, and we need to do it before anyone who might be watching sees us planning it. Come inside, Shep, he said. I have maps. They went inside. Deke's lamp was out in the bunkhouse. The ranch was quiet around them, holding its breath in the way that land sometimes did at night. aware of itself, aware of what was on it, full of a dark that was neither safe nor hostile, but simply indifferent, which was the truest kind. At the kitchen table, under the lamp, Rhett spread the land maps and they bent over them together, her shoulder close to his, and they began. Neither of them said much that wasn't necessary. They didn't need to. That, Mara was beginning to understand, was its own language between people. The particular fluency of two people who had stopped performing for each other and started just being in the same space, working on the same thing without the noise of it. Outside, the half moon came back from behind its cloud. The night insects kept their chorus. The land held the ranch and everything on it in its wide, dry, indifferent hands and waited for November. The maps stayed on the kitchen table for 3 days, not spread out and visible. Mara rolled them back up each morning and set them behind the flour bin where a casual eye wouldn't find them. But they came back out each evening after Deke had gone to the bunkhouse and the lamp was low and the ranch had gone quiet around them. And each evening she and Rhett sat across from each other and worked the problem the way you work a knot, patiently, from different angles, accepting that some approaches weren't going to open anything, and trying the next one without getting frustrated about it. The plan that emerged wasn't elegant. She wanted to be clear about that with herself, because she'd learned that plans that looked elegant on a table had a way of falling apart the moment they met actual ground. What they had was something sturdier than elegant, a plan with enough flexibility built into it to absorb the inevitable things that would go wrong. The core of it was simple: run the drive as announced, on the standard route with the standard timing. Let anyone watching report back that Calder Ranch was proceeding exactly as expected, a stretched operation running a barely sufficient herd through open country with minimal hands. Give Hartley, or whoever he'd sent to watch, no reason to change his approach. What wouldn't be visible was Deke riding 2 days ahead of the drive, quiet and unhurried, through the section of the route that passed through the Callaway Narrows, a half-mile stretch where the terrain pinched between two rocky ridges, the only place along the route where a small number of men could effectively stop a herd. If Hartley was going to hit the drive, that was where he'd do it. Deke would look and report back, and they'd know. The second piece was the county sheriff. "Briggs," Rhett said the first time she raised it. The word came out with the kind of controlled flatness that indicated a complicated history. "Is he crooked or just difficult?" she asked. Rhett thought about it. "Difficult. He's got no love for me. But I don't think he's in anyone's pocket." "Then he's useful." She looked at the map. "We can't handle organized violence with 3 people. We don't need to defeat them in the field. We need a witness with authority who can make the arrest mean something permanent. Someone who can take them into custody and make it stick legally so the syndicate can't just replace the men and try again. Briggs won't ride out on my word alone." "No," she said. "He'll need evidence he didn't get from you." She traced the route with her finger. "If we can get him positioned at the Narrows before they move, not because you asked him to, but because he has his own reason to be there." "What reason?" She looked up. "We give him one." It took her another 2 evenings to work out what that reason would be. And when she did, she told Rhett, and he looked at her for a long moment with an expression she'd started to recognize as the specific look of a man recalculating something he thought he'd already understood. "You'd go into town," he said. "Somebody has to. And it can't be you. You walking into Briggs's office would put him on the defensive before you said a word." "You've been here a month," he said. "You don't know Briggs." "I know what I need him to do," she said. "And I know how to talk to a man who thinks he's being managed, which is to not manage him." She paused. "I'll tell him the truth. Most of it." "Which part isn't most?" "I won't tell him the drive is bait," she said simply. "I'll tell him we have reason to believe the Donner Syndicate is planning an action against the herd during the drive, and that if he wants to catch them doing something that would hold up in a territorial court, the Narrows on the 14th is when and where." She kept her eyes on his. "That's all true. I'm just not explaining the architecture around it." Rhett was quiet. "He'll ask why you're coming to him instead of me," he said. "I'll tell him that you're too proud and I'm more practical." She said it without any particular tone. Something almost happened on his face. That almost smile, more present than usual. "That's also true," he said. "I know," she said. She rode into Black Ridge on a Wednesday morning, which she chose because Wednesday was when the sheriff's office was quiet. Court days were Monday, and by Friday the weekend trouble was already starting to accumulate. She wore her good dress, which was not fancy but was clean and pressed, and made her look, she hoped, like a woman with something worth listening to, rather than a woman trying to be taken seriously. She'd been back in town exactly once since her arrival at the ranch, 3 weeks prior, to pick up supplies. That visit had been brief and transactional, and she'd felt the town's attention on her the way you feel a change in temperature. Subtle, but unmistakable. The looks, mostly. The particular quality of people noticing her and making small adjustments in their expressions, recalibrating whatever expectation they'd had against the evidence of her presence. She hadn't been sent back. She suspected that alone had cost Dorothy Fenwick a bet. This visit was different. She didn't rush. She tied her horse at the post in front of the general store and went in and bought what she'd actually come to buy. Thread, salt, 2 pounds of coffee, and she let Dolores Pitcher ring her up and make small conversation, and she answered it with the normal brevity of a woman who had better things to do but wasn't in a hurry. "How's the ranch treating you?" Dolores asked. Genuine curiosity, Mara thought. Dolores was essentially decent, just easily influenced by louder opinions around her. "Working hard," Mara said, as expected. "And Mr. Calder, he's—" Dolores paused delicately. "A practical man," Mara said, "which suits me fine." She took her purchases and went to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Cal Briggs was 54 years old and had the bearing of a man who had started his career with ambitions and revised them downward over time until they fit the actual dimensions of his life. He wasn't a bad man, he was a tired one, which was sometimes harder to work with. He looked up when she came in, and his expression did a quick, involuntary adjustment that she recognized as him deciding what category she went in. "Mrs. Calder," he said, because news traveled fast in small towns. "Sheriff." She sat down across from his desk without being invited, which she did deliberately. "I'll be brief. I think you're going to have a situation at the Callaway Narrows on the 14th of next month, and I think you're going to want to be there." Briggs leaned back in his chair. "What kind of situation?" "The Donner Syndicate has been running a pressure campaign against my husband's operation for over a year," she said. "Sabotage. Theft. Placing informants in the hired help." She laid it out clean and factual, without heat. "We believe they intend to disrupt the November cattle drive at the Narrows. Given what we know about how they operate in other counties, that disruption is likely to involve violence." Briggs's expression was careful. "That's a serious accusation." "Yes," she said, "which is why I'm bringing it to the law rather than handling it ourselves." He looked at her for a moment. She could see him thinking, running it through whatever calculus a tired man in a complicated political landscape runs things through. The Donner Syndicate had money and reach, which meant they had friends in places that could make a county sheriff's life difficult. But they also, she suspected, had enemies in those same places, because organizations that operated the way they did always did. "What makes you think the 14th?" he asked. "The drive is scheduled for the 13th through the 17th. The Narrows is the second day. It's the only point on the route where a small group could effectively block a herd." She kept her voice level. "I don't think they'll wait for a harder position." "And you want me to—" "Be there," she said, "with whatever deputies make sense. Not to get into a gunfight, to arrest men in the commission of a crime in front of a witness with legal authority. So it means something that holds." Briggs looked at her for a long time. She held it. "Your husband know you're here?" he asked. "He knows I'm talking to you," she said. "He didn't come himself because I told him it would go better this way." "Why?" "Because you two have history I'm not part of," she said. "And I don't." He almost smiled, not warmly. It was the smile of a man who appreciated a certain kind of directness, even when he wasn't sure he trusted it. He looked at his desk for a moment, at nothing in particular. "I'll look into the Donner Syndicate's recent activity," he said. "If what you're saying checks out." "It will," she said. "Then I'll consider what position makes sense on the 14th. It was not a commitment, but it was more than she'd walked in with, and she recognized it for what it was. She stood up. "Thank you, Sheriff." "Mrs. Calder." He paused. "How long you been out at the Calder place?" "A month," she said. He nodded slowly, with the expression of a man adjusting something in his understanding. She left before he could decide to ask more questions. She was untying her horse when she heard her name. "Mara Holloway." She turned.
Dorothy Fenwick was standing on the boardwalk 20 feet away, in a good dress and a hat that had ambitions beyond its setting. She was a handsome woman in the way that women are handsome when they've always been told so and have organized their lives around it. She had two of her particular friends with her, Lila Marsh and Cecile Greer, who were standing slightly behind her in the arrangement of women who expect someone else to set the tone. Mara looked at her. She didn't correct the name. "Dorothy," she said. Dorothy came down off the boardwalk and crossed the street with the measured walk of someone who'd decided to do something and was committed to it. She stopped a few feet away and looked at Mara with the particular expression of someone trying to read an outcome they'd predicted incorrectly. "You're still out there," Dorothy said. "I am," Mara said. "How is he?" It was asked with a studied casualness that didn't quite cover the actual question underneath it, which was something more like, "What is it like and why is it working?" "He's well," Mara said. "Working hard. The operation's coming along." Dorothy looked at her for a moment, at her face, her dress, the horse behind her, and Mara could see her doing some kind of accounting that wasn't adding up the way she'd expected. There was something in Dorothy's expression she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was something more uncomfortable than that. It was the look of a woman who had been certain about something and was encountering evidence that her certainty had a flaw in it. "People said it wouldn't last a week," Dorothy said. Less aggressive than Mara had expected. More like someone thinking out loud. "People were wrong," Mara said. Flat, not cruel, just accurate. A silence. Lila Marsh said something quiet to Cecile Greer behind Dorothy's shoulder. Dorothy didn't turn around. "You look—" Dorothy started, then stopped. "I look like a woman who's been working," Mara said. "Because I have been." She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up onto the horse, which she managed without incident and without apology for the effort it required. She looked down at Dorothy from the saddle. "Give my regards to your brothers." She turned the horse and rode out of Black Ridge at a steady walk. Not a performance, not a statement, just a woman going home. She didn't look back, but she heard from somewhere behind her Lila Marsh say something to Dorothy, and she heard Dorothy's response, and the response wasn't laughter. That was enough. Deke left for the Narrows on a gray Thursday morning, 11 days before the drive, with a bedroll and enough food for a week, and the instruction to look and remember and come back with what he'd seen. He was the right person for it. He had the ability to move through country without drawing attention, the kind of presence that people's eyes skipped over. Not invisibility exactly, just ordinariness taken to its highest form. "Don't engage anything," Rhett told him in the yard before he left. "Wasn't planning to," Deke said. "If you see men positioned—" "I come back and tell you," Deke said. "I'm not 22, Calder. I know what reconnaissance is." Rhett nodded. Deke looked at Mara. "Anything specific you want me to look for?" She thought about it. "Secondary access. If they're going to block the Narrows, they'll need a way in that isn't the main route, somewhere they can position without being seen approaching. Look at the ridge lines on both sides. There'll be a path, probably from the east, where the rock gives them cover." Deke looked at her for a moment, then at Rhett, then back at her. "All right," he said, and rode out. The days between his departure and the drive had a particular quality to them, a suspended, pressurized quality, like the air before a storm when the light goes yellow and the animals go quiet and everything holds itself still. The work continued because work on a ranch didn't pause for anyone's anxiety, but underneath it there was a constant, low hum of attention, of waiting. Mara checked the herd count daily. 83 head, more than she'd hoped for, given the losses earlier in the year. Enough, if they made it to market. On the 8th day, she found Rhett in the barn late at night. She'd gotten up for water and seen the lamp burning, which was unusual. Rhett went to bed early because he rose early, and the barn at 11 at night meant something was wrong or something was occupying him that the house didn't have room for. She pulled on her boots and went out. He was sitting on a hay bale near the roan stall, not doing anything, just sitting. The roan was watching him with the calm, patient attention that particular horse seemed to give everything. The lamp hung on the hook near the door and threw soft yellow light over the space. She came in and sat down on a hay bale that was far enough away to not be presumptuous. He looked at her. "Couldn't sleep," he said, unnecessarily. "No," she agreed. They sat for a moment in the barn quiet. "If this goes wrong," he said. "It might go wrong," she said. "We should be honest about that." He looked at the roan. "If it does,
If we lose the herd, miss the bank payment, I'm finished here. There's no recovery from that. I know. You'd have no situation to come back to, he said. You'd be back where you started. Worse. She considered that. I'd be back where I started with the knowledge that I tried something real, she said. That's not nothing. He turned and looked at her properly. It's a lot to risk on a plan that came from a woman who'd been here 3 weeks when she proposed it. Yes, she said. It is. Why did you? He asked. You could have kept your head down, managed the house. Let whatever was going to happen, happen. You'd have been not comfortable, but safe. Not your problem. She thought about that honestly because he was asking it honestly. Because it is my problem, she said. This is my land now too. My situation. Not the way it was before I came here. Not something I'm managing on behalf of someone else and watching from the side. She paused. I've done that my whole life. Watched things happen to me and around me and managed them carefully and survived them. This is the first time I've been somewhere I actually want to hold on to. Something moved through his expression at that, not the almost smile. Something quieter. Even with all of it? He asked. All of it is what makes it worth holding, she said. He looked at her for a longer moment than was comfortable, and she didn't look away from it this time. And something passed between them in that barn with the lamp and the roan watching and the night around them that she didn't try to name or categorize or put anywhere safe. Then he said, quietly, Deke will be back tomorrow. I know, she said. We'll know what we're dealing with. Yes. He stood up and took the lamp off the hook and offered her his hand for no particular reason. The floor between the bale and the door was perfectly navigable, and after a moment she took it, and they walked out of the barn and across the dark yard to the house. He let go of her hand at the porch steps. She went inside. She lay in her room and listened to the ranch settle around her and thought about that moment, not analyzing it, just holding it briefly before she set it aside. There would be time for it later if there was a later, if they were still standing after November. Deke came back the following afternoon, dusty and tired and eating half the kitchen before he said a word. Then he unrolled the rough sketch he'd made and laid it on the table between them. They're there, he said. Or someone is. 6 men, East Ridge, exactly where she said. He looked at Mara when he said it. There's a covered approach from the old Miller Trail. Comes in behind the rock formation on the north side. They've got a camp, looks like 3-4 days established. He traced the sketch with one finger. They're set up to come down both sides simultaneously, block the front of the herd and push in from the flanks. Designed to scatter the cattle rather than just stop them. Scatter the cattle, not steal them. Scatter them across open country, where rounding them up before the market deadline would be nearly impossible. They don't want the herd, Mara said, mostly to herself. They want the count destroyed. Hartley, Rhett said. It wasn't a question. One of the men, big, scar across the chin. Deke looked at Rhett. You know him. I know him, Rhett said. Something went tight in the room then. The confirmation of it, not just suspected, but real, present, waiting, had a different weight than the suspicion had. Mara looked at the sketch. She looked at the approach trail. She looked at the position of the ridge and the mouth of the narrows and the angle from which 6 men could come down on a moving herd. Then she looked at Rhett. We need to change the timing, she said. Not by much, just enough. He looked at the sketch. His jaw was working. If Briggs is going to be positioned, she said, he needs to be in place before they come down from that ridge. And we need to make sure they come down before the herd does. You want to bait the trigger? Rhett said slowly. I want them committed and moving before they realize what they're moving into, she said. 6 men on an open ridge coming down on what they think is an unprotected herd and a county sheriff with deputies positioned at the mouth of the narrows. It could work, Deke said. He was looking at the sketch with the focused attention of a man doing practical math. If the timing is right, if Briggs shows. Briggs will show, she said. She believed it, and not just because she needed to. Rhett put his hands flat on the table and looked at the sketch for a long time. She let him look. This was his land, his herd, his history, with the man waiting on that ridge. It was her plan, but it had to be his choice. He straightened up. All right, he said, walk me through the timing. She did. Outside, the October light was going copper and long across the dry grass, and the herd moved in the south pasture the way herds do, shifting and settling, individual animals invisible in the mass of them, all of it looking like a single slow-breathing thing from a distance. 11 days. 11 days, and they would know. The drive started on a cold Tuesday morning with a sky the color of old pewter and a wind out of the north that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to become something serious. Mara had been up since 4, not from anxiety, or not only from that. There was genuine work to do before first light, the kind of preparation that determined whether the first hours of a cattle drive went clean or went sideways before it had properly begun. She'd packed the supply bags the night before, checked and rechecked the medical kit she was bringing, not for the cattle, or not only for them, and laid out her riding clothes with the methodical attention of someone who understood that small details compounded. Rhett found her in the barn at 4:30, already saddled up. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her. "You don't have to ride the whole drive," he said. "I know," she said. A pause. "Mara?" "Rhett." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not staying here while you ride into something I designed. That's not how this works." He held her gaze for a moment. She could see him assembling an argument and then disassembling it, because he understood, as she did, that there was no version of this where she waited at the ranch house and found out afterward how it had gone. That wasn't the woman she was. He'd had 5 weeks to understand that, and she believed he had. "Stay toward the rear of the herd," he said finally. "Don't move up until whatever's going to happen has happened." "That was already my plan," she said. He looked at her for one more moment. That look, the one she'd stopped trying to categorize. And then he went to saddle the roan. Deke had the lead cattle moving before sunrise. He was the best horseman among them, and he took the point position with the ease of someone who'd done it enough times that his body knew the work before his mind caught up. The herd, 83 head, every one of them accounted for that morning, moved out of the south pasture and onto the drive route in the gray pre-dawn, and Mara brought up the rear, and Calder Ranch disappeared behind them as the light came up slow and cold over the hill country. The first day was long and uneventful in the particular grinding way of cattle drives, which was something people who hadn't done one tended to romanticize, and people who had tended to remember primarily as exhausting. Cattle did not cooperate on principle. They drifted, they bunched wrong. They found the one gap in a natural fence line that shouldn't have been a gap and pushed through it with the collective stubbornness of animals that had no awareness of anyone's schedule. Deke handled the lead with steady competence. Rhett worked the flanks. Mara stayed rear and slightly wide, keeping the stragglers moving and watching the surrounding terrain with the kind of sustained attention that made her eyes ache by late afternoon. Nothing came at them on the first day. She hadn't expected it to. The Narrows was day 2. They camped at a creek crossing that had enough water left in it to be useful. Not much. The drought had taken most of it, but enough. The cattle drank in long, patient lines and settled into the grass along the bank. The 3 of them made a fire and ate without much conversation, and Mara watched the darkness around the camp and listened, because listening was something she was better at than most people, and she knew it. "Briggs," Rhett said, across the fire. Not a question. A thought said out loud. "He said he'd look into it," Mara said. "He will have. And if he decided it wasn't worth his trouble, then we deal with what comes without him." She looked at Rhett across the fire. His face in the firelight was all shadow and angle, and she could read the tension in it, the thing he was holding. "But he'll be there. You can't know that." "No," she admitted, "but I know how a man looks when he's already made a decision and is letting you think he hasn't yet." Briggs had made up his mind before I left his office. Deke, who had been lying with his hat over his face, said from under the brim, "She's right. Briggs wants the syndicate more than he wants to stay comfortable. I've known him 12 years. He's been waiting for something to stick." Rhett looked at Deke. "Would have been useful to know that earlier," he said. "You didn't ask," Deke said, and didn't move the hat. Mara almost smiled. She turned away so Rhett wouldn't see it. She took the second watch and sat in the dark beside the low fire while the cattle breathed and shuffled around her and the cold deepened and the stars came out fierce and thick. She sat with her rifle across her knees, Rhett's spare, which he'd handed her without discussion on the morning of departure. And she thought about the narrows and the timing and the 6 men on the ridge and the particular face she'd never seen but felt she knew from the way Rhett's voice went flat when he said the name. Cole Hartley. She thought about what Rhett had told her, say, Ebner Walsh, the final offer, the 2 men Hartley had brought. She thought about Rhett getting in the way of something and paying for it in scar tissue, and she thought about what it took to do that. To put yourself between something and someone when it would have been easier not to. She'd wondered sometimes, in the weeks since he'd told her, what kind of person he'd been before that moment, before Walsh's ranch, before the syndicate, before Black Ridge. She hadn't asked, because there were things people needed to keep their own shape around, things that lost their form when you put them into words too directly. But she thought about it. She thought about a man who'd done work he didn't fully understand, and then, when the moment arrived where he had to understand it, had chosen correctly. At cost. And had come north and started something of his own and spent 2 years protecting it with a silence that the town had filled in wrong. She thought, I understand that. The night passed without incident. She woke Rhett for the last watch and went to her bedroll and slept hard and dreamlessly until the sky went gray again. The Narrows was 6 miles into day 2. They reached the approach to it mid-morning, when the light had gone flat white and the wind had picked up enough to move the dry grass in long waves. The terrain here changed. The rolling country tightened, the ridges on either side rising and drawing together, the rock coming through the surface of the land like bones through skin. It was, objectively, a beautiful piece of country. It was also, as Deke's sketch had shown, an ideal location to make something very bad happen to a moving herd. Mara felt the change in the cattle before she could articulate why. Animals that lived outside read the world through their bodies in ways that bypassed language, and herds had a collective sensing that individual animals didn't, a distributed nervousness that moved through them like a current. The rear of the herd had begun to bunch slightly, the cattle pressing together in the way they did when something they couldn't identify was making them uneasy. She kept her position, but she put her hand on the rifle. 200 yards ahead, she could see Deke at the point, steady and unhurried, the lead cattle following him into the narrowing of the terrain. Rhett was on the right flank, visible intermittently as the land rose and fell. The plan, in its simplest form, Deke would take the lead cattle to the midpoint of the Narrows, where the passage was at its tightest. Rhett would drop back on the right flank and fire 2 shots into the air, the signal, both to Mara and to Briggs and his deputies, who should be positioned at the mouth of the Narrows exit. The shots would provoke Hartley's men to move, because they would interpret it as a signal from someone inside the drive rather than what it was, and they would come down off the ridge before the full herd had entered the passage. The cattle, panicked by the shots, would push forward and crowd the Narrows. Hartley's men, descending into a tighter space than they'd planned for, with a sheriff's deputies at the exit and a herd between them and retreat, would be caught. It was a sound plan on paper. It lasted until Rhett's signal shots, when 3 things went wrong more or less simultaneously. The first shot went fine. The second shot, Mara heard it and registered the moment, her whole body going alert and ready, was followed almost immediately by something that was not supposed to happen. A third shot, from a different direction, from the east ridge, and not aimed at the sky. She heard it. She saw Rhett's horse go sideways on the flank, scrambling, Rhett leaning hard to control it. They'd had a watcher she and Deke hadn't accounted for. A 7th man, posted lower and closer, who'd been watching the drive from a position that Deke's reconnaissance hadn't covered. And this man had understood the signal shots for what they were fast enough to fire before Hartley's men had fully committed. The herd reacted, 83 cattle in an enclosed passage, with shots going off and the smell of gunpowder and the particular atmospheric charge of human panic translating itself through the ground into their hooves. They didn't stampede, not yet, but they surged. The rear of the herd pushed forward into the front, and the front had nowhere to go but forward, and the whole mass of them began to move with the compressing urgency of a thing that had lost individual intention and become purely force. Mara made a decision in about 2 seconds. She pulled the rifle from its scabbard and pushed her horse wide of the rear of the herd, moving up along the outside of the east ridge, rather than trying to go through the cattle. It was rough terrain, loose shale, steep angle, her horse picking its footing in a way that required her to trust it absolutely, which she did because she'd been riding this horse for 5 weeks, and she knew its quality. She moved fast and stayed low, and she was looking for the 7th man, the watcher. because if he fired again, he was going to finish spooking the herd, and the stampede that followed would scatter everything they'd built this plan to protect. She found him before he found her. He was positioned behind a rock outcropping about 30 feet up the east ridge, and he was reloading with the focused haste of someone who'd made his first shot in a hurry and was intending to do better with the second. He was young, younger than she'd expected, maybe 20, the kind of young that gets hired for dangerous work because young men underestimate the cost. "Stop," she said. She had the rifle up and she was 12 feet from him, and she was not shaking, which surprised her slightly in a distant way because her heart was going very fast. He looked up. He looked at her. He looked at the rifle. He was young enough that he made the right choice. He put the rifle down on the rock and put his hands up and said, "Don't," in the voice of someone who had just understood that they were in a situation significantly above their pay. "Lie down," she said, "face down. Put your hands where I can see them." He did it. She could hear the herd below, the thunder of it, the concentrated energy of panicked cattle in a stone passage. And she could hear shouting and one more shot from the ridge above. And then, from the mouth of the Narrows, she heard what she'd been listening for, the authoritative, carrying voice of a man who was used to being obeyed in chaotic situations. Briggs. She couldn't hear the words clearly, too much noise between them, but the sound of it had a shape she recognized. Law. Arriving. She kept her rifle on the young man on the ground, and she looked down into the Narrows passage and she tried to understand what she was seeing. The herd had surged to the exit point, and Briggs's men had been smart enough to spread wide and let the cattle through rather than try to stop them, which was the only move that could have worked, and she was grateful someone on that side had understood it. The cattle poured out of the Narrows in a compressed running mass and dispersed into the wider country beyond, and in the passage itself there was a different kind of chaos. Men down from the ridges, the collision of Hartley's plan with the reality that the exit wasn't clear, that there were armed deputies where there should have been nothing, that the whole geometry of the attack had been inverted. She heard Hartley before she saw him. His voice carried even in the noise, commanding, furious, the voice of a man who was processing a reversal and not accepting it gracefully. "Back up. Get back. Get to the horses." "Cole Hartley." Briggs, clearer now, from somewhere below. "You are under arrest by authority of Bazar County. Put down your weapons." A pause that lasted about 3 seconds. Then more shouting and 2 more shots, and then a sound she couldn't identify, and then a long, ragged silence that felt enormous after all the noise. The young man on the ground below her said, into the dirt, "Is it over?" "Stay where you are," she said. She kept her position for another 2 minutes, listening, reading what she could from the sounds below. The cattle noise was moving away. The herd had passed through and was spreading out beyond the Narrows, which was not ideal, but they were moving away from the violence rather than into it, which meant they were manageable. She could hear Briggs's deputies calling to each other, the kind of shouting that meant organization rather than emergency. She heard one man crying out in pain from somewhere in the passage. Not Rhett's voice, she was almost certain. And she heard Briggs's voice again, still controlled, giving orders. Then she heard Rhett. "Mara." His voice from below and to her left, rough and strained and carrying a quality that made her throat tighten. "Here," she called back. A pause. "You all right?" "Yes, I have one of them. The watcher they posted lower on the ridge." She kept the rifle on the man on the ground. "You?" Another pause, slightly longer than it should have been. "Mostly," he said. She didn't like mostly. She filed it and dealt with it as fast as she could. She got the young man on his feet and made him walk ahead of her down the ridge to the floor of the Narrows, which he did with the careful obedience of someone who had fully updated his understanding of the situation. The Narrows passage was a mess. 2 of Hartley's men were down, one with a leg wound, one with something worse that a deputy was dealing with as efficiently as the circumstances allowed. 2 more were standing with their hands up and their expressions in various stages of shock and resignation. A 5th was sitting against the rock wall with his head in his hands. Hartley himself was on his knees in the center of the passage, with his hands bound behind him and Briggs standing over him. He looked up when Mara came through with the 7th man, and his face went through several things quickly. The assessment, the anger, the adjustment. He was, she could see, a man who was doing rapid calculations even now, his eyes moving to her and then back to Briggs, and then around the passage, counting, measuring. 6 of you and a watcher, Briggs said to him, not looking away from him. Planning, positioning, intent. He let that settle for a moment. We'll be talking about this for a while, Mr. Hartley. Hartley didn't respond. Mara found Rhett at the south end of the passage, near where it opened up into wider country. He was standing rather than sitting, which she took as a positive sign, but he was holding his left arm against his side in a way that wasn't natural. "Show me," she said when she reached him. "It's not serious." "Show me anyway." He turned and she saw the tear in his coat, high on the upper arm, and when she got the coat off, he didn't make it easy, not because of pride, but because moving the arm hurt, and she understood the difference. She found a graze. A clean cut through the surface of the muscle, not deep, not involving anything vital, but bleeding steadily and needing to be cleaned and wrapped before the cold got into it. "Sit down," she said. "The cattle—" "Deke is handling the cattle," she said. "Sit down." He sat down on a rock with the relieved heaviness of someone who has been standing on will alone for a period of time and has now been given permission to stop. She cleaned the wound with what she had in the kit and wrapped it tight and did it quickly and without ceremony because that was what it needed. He held still through it. She was aware of his eyes on her face while she worked. She could feel them. But she focused on the work until the work was done. "There," she said. He looked at the wrapping, then he looked at her. "You went up the ridge." "Someone had to. I heard you tell him to lie down." Something in his voice she couldn't quite name. "He was young," she said. "I didn't think he'd be stupid about it." "What if he had been?" She held his gaze. "Then I would have handled that." He looked at her for a long moment. His face had the particular quality it got when it was doing something complicated underneath the surface, the controlled expression that she'd learned over 5 weeks to see past. "The plan worked," he said. "Mostly," she said, because the watcher was the variable they'd missed, and she believed in being accurate about where plans had gaps. "Mostly," he agreed, and almost smiled. From up the passage, she heard Briggs's voice organizing the arrest and the transport, heard the deputies answering. She heard Deke somewhere beyond the Narrows exit, calling to the cattle in his flat, carrying voice, getting the herd together. She heard one of Hartley's men say something to a deputy, and the deputy's short, firm response. She heard, underneath all of it, the sound of the land reasserting itself. The wind through the rock formations, the movement of dry grass, a hawk somewhere high above calling once and going silent. "We need to count the herd," she said. "Give me a minute," Rhett said. She gave him 2. She sat on the rock beside him and they looked out at the country beyond the Narrows, the wide, dry gold of it spreading south, and the cattle visible in the distance as small, dark shapes beginning to slow and settle now that the noise was behind them. 83, he said after a while. "Probably 82, she said. "We'll know when Deke gets them together. 1 down from 83 is still enough." "Yes," she said. "It is." He looked at her sideways. "You knew Briggs would come." "I told you I did." "I didn't fully believe you," he said. Not defensive, just honest. "I know," she said. "That's all right." He turned to look at her fully, and this time the expression on his face was not complicated. It was simple in the way that things are simple when they've been arrived at through complicated means. Clear, unambiguous, arrived at. "Mara," he said. "We should get to the herd," she said. Not from fear, from the same instinct she'd always had, to let things complete themselves before she named them. Some things needed to be held a little longer before they were real. He understood, she thought. He didn't push it. He stood up, favoring the arm, and she stood beside him, and they walked out of the Narrows together into the flat, cold sunlight, and the land opened up around them with its enormous indifference, and somewhere ahead of them Deke was calling cattle home. 82 head, one lost in the chaos, found 2 days later, 3 miles north, alive and irritated. 83 in the end. Enough. The cattle market in Sandover was 3 days' ride from the Narrows, and they arrived on a Friday afternoon with 83 head. The stray had been found exactly where Deke predicted, irritated and hungry and fundamentally unharmed, and sold at a price that was not remarkable but was sufficient. Sufficient for the bank payment. Sufficient for the quarterly review. Sufficient by a margin that was uncomfortable but real, To keep Calder Ranch on the right side of the line, it had been walking for over a year. Rhett stood at the stockyard fence and watched the last of the cattle move through the gate and said nothing for a long time. Mara stood beside him. She didn't fill the silence. "It's enough," he said finally. "Yes," she said. He turned to look at her. His arm was still wrapped. She'd redressed the wound at camp each of the 3 nights on the drive out, and it was healing cleanly, the way cuts healed when they were tended to properly, and the person they belonged to didn't do anything catastrophically stupid with the affected limb. He'd done moderately stupid things with it, which she'd addressed each time with the same flat practicality, and he'd tolerated her addressing it with the slightly grudging compliance of a man who understood he didn't have a strong argument. "The bank meeting is Tuesday," he said. "I know." After that, he stopped, started differently. After that, whatever the syndicate tries next, they're trying it without Hartley and without 6 of their field men and with a county sheriff who has every reason to keep looking at them. He said it like he was still processing the reality of it, not disbelieving, but not yet fully inhabiting. "It's not finished, but it's different." "It's very different," she said. He looked at the empty stockyard pen where the cattle had been. "You know what the margin is," he said. "On the payment. You've seen the accounts." "I know what it is. It's not comfortable." "No," she agreed, "but it's real. And we can work with real." He turned to look at her fully then, and she held it, as she'd learned to do with the particular quality of his attention. It had taken her most of 5 weeks to stop wanting to look away from it, not because it was threatening, but because it was, in its way, the most direct thing she'd ever had pointed at her. Rhett Calder looked at things, when he looked at them, with his whole attention. It was disconcerting, and then, gradually, it was something she'd started to feel the absence of when it wasn't there. "You said we," he said. "I did," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I want to make sure you know what you came into and what you stayed for. I want to make sure that's a choice you're making clear-eyed, not obligation, not because there's nowhere else to go." She looked at him. "Rhett, I held a rifle on a man on a rock ledge above a cattle passage and told him to lie face down. I think I'm capable of making clear-eyed choices." Something finally broke through on his face. Not the almost smile, not the complicated expression she'd catalogued over 5 weeks. An actual, full, unguarded smile, brief and real, and not performing anything for anyone. It was gone quickly, the way things are that aren't used to the light. "Fair point," he said. Deke, who had been deliberately occupied with something at the far end of the stockyard fence, chose that moment to walk past them and say, without looking at either of them, "I'll get the horses watered. Take your time." Mara looked at the back of his retreating figure. "He has the subtlety of a dropped anvil," Rhett said. "I like him," she said. "So do I," he said. "Unfortunately." They rode back to the ranch in 4 days, taking it easier than the drive out. The horses lightened without the herd to manage. The country looked different going home, or it felt different, which was maybe the same thing. The sky was November now, lower and grayer, with a quality of waiting that the Texas hill country got in late autumn, as if the land were preparing itself for something it had been through enough times to take seriously. The first night back at the ranch, Mara walked the east fence line again. Same line she'd walked on her first evening, 5 weeks ago, when she'd found the cut wire and the shifted post that had started all of it. She walked it in the early dark with a lamp, going slow, looking. The sections she and Deke had repaired held. The posts were solid, the wire ran true. She stood at the furthest section and held the lamp up and looked back toward the house, where the kitchen window threw a rectangle of yellow light into the dark yard, and she felt something she recognized after a moment as the specific, unglamorous satisfaction of a person who has done what they said they were going to do. Not triumph, not vindication, just completion. The quiet closing of a thing. She walked back to the house. The bank meeting happened on a Tuesday, as scheduled, and Rhett came back from it in the early afternoon with the expression of a man who has been through something unpleasant and come out intact. He found Mara in the kitchen and stood in the doorway and said, "Done." And she looked up from what she was doing and said, "All of it?" And he said, "Payment accepted. Reviewer noted the operation had shown recent improvement. We have until spring before the next review." She turned back to the counter. Good. Mara. She turned around again. He was still in the doorway, and he was looking at her with that expression. The one she had a word for now, had had one for a while, had just been waiting for the right moment to acknowledge. I told the bank reviewer that recent improvement in the operation was largely attributable to my wife. She was quiet for a moment. Why did you say that? Because it's accurate, he said, and because I wanted to say something accurate out loud, in front of someone else, about what you've done here. He paused. Because I don't think I say things like that enough. I know I don't. She looked at him across the kitchen. He was not a man who delivered speeches. He was not a man who organized his feelings into presentations. This was costing him something. She could see that. Not in a dramatic way, just in the way it costs anyone to say a true thing plainly when they've spent a long time not doing it. Rhett, she said. I know. You shouldn't have to just know, he said. You should hear it. She crossed the kitchen and stopped in front of him, which required her to tilt her head back slightly to look at his face at this distance, which she did without any particular self-consciousness, because she'd stopped performing self-consciousness about her own dimensions somewhere around the second week. He looked down at her. Then say whatever else you're trying to say, she said. And say it plain. He was quiet for a moment. His jaw did the thing it did when he was holding something. I didn't marry you because I needed a housekeeper, he said. I told myself I did, and I needed someone. That part was true. But the specific person, he stopped. You were sent out here as a joke, a town full of people who thought they were packaging up their problem and delivering it to someone else's. And I let that frame it for me at the beginning, like it was a transaction. It was a transaction, she said, at the beginning. It's not now, he said. It hasn't been for a while. She held his gaze. He held hers. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass, and one of the horses called out once in the paddock, and the kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and the particular warmth of a house that was being lived in. No, she said, it hasn't. He reached up and touched her face, just briefly, just the side of his hand against her jaw. The way someone touches something they've been careful around for a long time and have finally decided to stop being careful about. She let him. She turned her face slightly into it, which was the truest thing she'd done in a long time. I should have said things sooner, he said. You're saying them now, she said. That's sufficient. He almost smiled. And then he did. The same real brief, unguarded smile she'd seen at the stockyard fence, and this time it lasted a little longer. She was not a woman who cried easily. She didn't cry then, but something in her chest shifted and settled into a new position, and she recognized it as the specific feeling of a thing that had been homeless for a long time finding its address. The news of what had happened at the Narrows reached Black Ridge before they did. News in small Texas towns in 1881 traveled on horseback, and by word of mouth and with the particular acceleration of stories that were interesting enough to pass along with embellishment. By the time Rhett and Mara returned, the essential facts had been distributed. Cole Hartley and 6 syndicate men arrested in the Callaway Narrows, caught in a failed attempt to destroy a cattle drive by Sheriff Briggs with deputies, and the operation set up by the Calder Ranch. By a plan, people were saying, that the wife had designed. Mara found out what they were saying from Dolores Pitcher, who told her 3 days after their return, in the dry goods store, in the excited tone of someone delivering information they expected to be received as positive. People are talking, Dolores said, about what you did, about the whole thing. I did what made sense, Mara said. She was reading a list. Have you got any more of that salt pork, or is this the last of it? There's more in the back. Dolores looked at her with the frank curiosity of a woman trying to reconcile the person in front of her with the story she'd been telling herself. Dorothy Fenwick has been very quiet. Dorothy Fenwick doesn't know me, Mara said. She never did. She said... Dolores stopped. I know what she said, Mara said. It doesn't matter now. She looked up from her list. Dolores, I'm not interested in being a story that people tell. I'm interested in getting back to my ranch. Can you get the salt pork? Dolores got the salt pork. But the story had its own momentum, the way stories do. Within the week, Sheriff Briggs had sent formal documentation to the territorial court detailing the syndicate's activities in Bayard County. Not just the Narrows incident, but the pattern behind it. the evidence of 14 months of systematic sabotage against Calder Ranch, and, it emerged, similar operations against 3 other small ranches in the county who had also refused to sell. 2 of those ranches had already been foreclosed. The third was still operating. Briggs came out to the ranch himself to tell them. He sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee Mara put in front of him and said, "The territorial court is taking it up. Hartley's talking, which I expect is because someone offered him something to talk with. The syndicate's San Antonio office has lawyered up, which is what they do, but the documentation is solid." He looked at Rhett. "You'll likely be called as a witness. Your history with the operation." "I know," Rhett said. "Your wife too, probably." Briggs looked at Mara with the expression she'd seen in his office the day she'd come to him. The recalibrating look, the look of a man updating a model. The cut wire, the waterline. Groves. "Whatever's useful," she said. Briggs nodded. He turned his coffee mug in his hands. "You know, when you came to my office," he said, "I almost didn't take you seriously." "I know," she said. "You were very sure." "I was right," she said, simply. "Which is different from sure." He looked at her for a moment, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He laughed. Not a polite laugh. An actual one, brief and surprised out of him. "Yes," he said, "it is." He left after an hour, and Rhett walked him out, and Mara cleared the coffee mugs and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the yard. The repaired fence posts visible from here, the paddock where all 3 horses were moving in the afternoon light, the barn with its sound roof where Deke had replaced the failing section in October, all of it standing, all of it held. The letter from Gerald Holloway arrived the following week. She almost didn't open it. She held it in her hands for a moment, feeling its weight, knowing what texture of thing was inside. Gerald wrote letters the way he did everything, with the particular style of someone who needed you to believe they were doing you a favor. She opened it. It was, as she'd expected, a request. The remaining Holloway estate had run into difficulties, the nature of which Gerald described in vague but urgent terms, and he was writing to ask whether she might be in a position to provide some assistance, given her current situation. She read it once. Then she set it on the kitchen table and went out to the barn and found Rhett doing something with the roan saddle, and she handed him the letter without comment. He read it. His jaw tightened. He read it again. "No," he said. "I know," she said. "I just wanted you to see it." He looked at her. "You're not going to—" "I'm not going to do anything," she said. "I wanted to know how you'd respond when you read it." He stared at her for a moment. "You were testing me." "I was learning something," she said. "There's a difference." He held her gaze. Then he handed the letter back to her. "What do you want to do with it?" She thought about Gerald's face in the barn doorway 4 years ago, managing what was left of her parents' estate into his own pockets with the confidence of a man who believed she would never have anywhere else to go. She thought about the morning she'd left Black Ridge, the town on the boardwalk, the laughter she hadn't let herself react to. She folded the letter and set it on the workbench. "Nothing," she said. "I don't need to do anything with it." She looked at Rhett. "He counted on me having no options. I have options. That's enough." Rhett looked at the letter on the workbench. Then he looked at her, and there was something in his face. Not the complicated expression, not the almost smile, not the careful caution. Just directness, plain and undefended. "You have more than options," he said. "You have this place. You have what you built here." "We built," she said. "We built," he agreed. Deke found them like that, standing in the barn in the afternoon light, not doing much of anything, just being in the same space in the particular way of 2 people who have stopped needing to justify their proximity to each other. He looked at them both and said, with great practicality, "The northwest gate hinge is going again." Rhett looked at Mara. Mara looked at Rhett. "I'll get the tools," she said. December came, and with it the first real rain in months. Mara stood on the porch and watched it come in from the north. A real rain, not the teasing drizzle that the hill country sometimes offered in lieu of the actual thing, but a sustained gray, soaking rain that darkened the dry earth and filled the air with the smell of wet rock and grass and the particular relief of land that has been thirsty for a long time. The cattle moved to the south pasture and stood in it, unbothered. The horses in the paddock lifted their heads and then went back to their hay, which was the considered opinion of animals that had made peace with weather. Rhett came out and stood beside her. They watched the rain. "The south pasture will come back," he said, "with enough of this." "The east section too," she said. "By spring." He was quiet for a moment. "Deke says he's staying," he said. "If we want him." "Of course we want him," she said. "Tell him to stop asking." "I'll tell him you said so. He listens to you better." She looked sideways at him. He was watching the rain with the expression of a man who was allowing himself, carefully and without drama, to believe in something. She recognized it because she'd been doing the same thing herself for several weeks. Not a sudden certainty, but a slow and accumulating trust. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that you find one day has become the foundation of everything without your ever having laid a cornerstone. She put her hand through his arm. Not a grand gesture. Just a hand and an arm, and the rain in front of them, and the land behind it, and all the ordinary, complicated, unfinished life on both sides of them. He put his other hand over hers. They stood there for a while. She thought about this morning she'd left Black Ridge. The town on the boardwalk, the borrowed wagon, the laughter she'd held herself straight against. She thought about arriving here with 2 trunks and a veterinary manual, and the particular determination of a woman who had decided, very quietly, that she was not going to be what other people had decided she was. She thought, this is not a happy ending. It's something better than that. It's a real one. There was still the territorial court, and the testimony, and whatever the syndicate's lawyers were going to attempt in the spring. There was still a ranch that was viable but not comfortable, a bank review in 4 months, a northwest gate hinge that kept failing no matter how many times Deke fixed it. There was still the drought-damaged east pasture and the question of the spring cattle count and the 100 small problems that a working piece of land generated on a daily basis without anyone's input. There was Rhett, who was not easy, who had spent years building walls out of silence and was only now, slowly, deciding which ones were structural and which ones could come down. Who had a scar that told a story about who he'd been before this, and a ranch that told a story about what he'd tried to build after, and a way of looking at her that she had finally stopped needing to look away from. There was Mara, who was not easy either, who had spent years watching and waiting and surviving, and had arrived here still carrying the habit of making herself smaller than she was, still flinching sometimes at the expectation of contempt, still occasionally surprised, genuinely surprised, to find herself in a place where her presence was not a problem to be managed, but a fact that mattered. Who was learning, at 24, the strength is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act anyway, and that being underestimated is only an advantage if you're paying attention. There was Deke, who would fix the gate hinge again tomorrow without complaining, and the 3 horses, and the 83 cattle, and the land itself, the dry, enormous, indifferent Texas hill country, which did not care about any of them but held them anyway, the way land holds everything that lives on it, without judgment and without mercy and with a patience that made human lives look brief and bright and worth the trouble. The rain came down on all of it. Mara felt Rhett shift his weight beside her, not moving away, just settling, the way people settle when they're exactly where they intended to be. From inside the house, the stove ticked in the warmth. From the barn, one of the horses made a quiet sound and then was still. The rain, the land. The 2 of them on the porch, in the ordinary, extraordinary fact of being people who had found, by difficult and unlikely means, the particular kind of company that makes the hard thing bearable and the good thing real. That was all. That was enough.